Hey, this is Dave the Camp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, May 10th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The US and the UK vowed to support Ukraine no matter what. So, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his British counterpart James Cleverly vowed on Tuesday that the US and Britain will continue supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia, regardless of the result of Kiev's expected counteroffensive. Cleverly said at a joint press conference with Blinken in Washington, quote, "We need to continue to support them, irrespective of whether this forthcoming offensive generates huge gains on the battlefield, because until this conflict is resolved and resolved properly, it is not over," end quote. So Blinken strongly backed Cleverly's comments. Listen to this quote from him. He said, quote, "I can only violently agree with my friend and strongly endorse what he's just said. We have exactly the same perspective," end quote. Blinken also disputed the notion that support for Ukraine in Washington was waning, pointing to House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who recently expressed strong support for backing Kiev. Blinken said, quote, "I would refer you, for example, just recently to the very strong statement made by the Speaker of the House, McCarthy, about support for Ukraine and the enduring support and determination to see this through," end quote. So the pledge from Cleverly and Blinken, it comes as there are a lot of signs that Ukraine's counteroffensive may not be successful. Ukraine's defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, just said the other day that the West should lower its expectations for the assault. And as I've covered a lot, the Discord leaks, one of those Pentagon documents, was a U.S. assessment from February that showed the U.S. did not believe Ukraine could regain significant territory. Last week, Blinken said, the Ukrainian military is in much better shape now than it was a few months back, dismissed the leaks, but there was also a report from Politico on April 24th that said current assessments are similar. There was another report from the New York Times around that time, and just comments from Ukrainian officials saying, we, don't have high expectations of us. So you still have Blinken saying that he thinks it will be successful, but now I guess they're saying even if it's not, we're going to keep supporting Ukraine. There has been some hawks in the U.S., like Michael McCaul, the head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He said the other day, he acknowledged that if the counteroffensive is not successful, it will probably not bode well for continued support for Ukraine. All right, so the next one here, speaking of continued support, the U.S. announces a $1.2 billion aid package for Ukraine. So this was announced on Tuesday, and it includes additional 155 millimeter artillery ammunition and air defense systems. So this massive package, $1.2 billion, it's a lot that they're going to be sending, but it's being provided through something called the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. And that allows the Pentagon to purchase military equipment for Kiev, which means it could take months or years to deliver these arms. Most of the U.S. military aid to Ukraine has been provided through the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows President Biden to send weapons directly from Pentagon stockpiles. The Pentagon said that the announcement, quote, represents the beginning of a contracting process to provide additional priority capabilities to Ukraine, end quote. And they said that the weapons package represents the U.S. commitment to supporting Kiev for the long term. The Pentagon said, quote, this USAI package underscores the continued U.S. commitment to meeting Ukraine's most urgent requirements by committing critical near-term capabilities such as air defense systems and munitions, while also building the capacity of Ukraine's armed forces to defend its territory and deter Russian aggression over the long term, end quote. So the package includes, according to the list released by the Pentagon, additional air defense systems and munitions, equipment to integrate Western air defense launchers, missiles, and radars with Ukraine's air defense systems, ammunition for counter unmanned aerial systems, 155 millimeter artillery rounds, commercial satellite imagery services, support for training, maintenance, and sustainment activities. The Pentagon did not specify what type of air defense systems would be provided, but U.S. officials told AP that it would include Raytheon made Hawk systems. And this new aid brings the total that the U.S. has pledged in military equipment alone to Kiev since Russia invaded last year to over $36.9 billion. And that's just what, they're telling us about. Again, that's military equipment alone. They're spending that 113 billion in a lot of different ways. And I should have mentioned in this article, because some people, it can be confusing because they announced these new weapons packages, but they're still pulling from that 113 billion, specifically from the $45 billion aid package that Congress authorized in December. That's still being spent. So this 1.2 billion is coming from that. So still the total that the US has authorized to spend on this war is still 113 billion, which is an enormous amount of money. But I'm guessing that they're going to run out of that money soon, and that the White House will be asking Congress for another package soon. The big question is going to be is if it's going to be as massive as the other ones have been. All right, so the next one here, this article is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. Poland confirms the transfer of warplanes to Ukraine. So Warsaw said that it has bolstered Kiev's air force by transferring 10 MiG-29 warplanes. Poland was the first NATO member to make the pledge to send Ukraine fighter jets. And Poland's defense minister has confirmed that the weapons transfer had taken place. At first, it wasn't clear exactly how many MiGs Poland was sending. At first, they sent, I think, 4, but now it looks like 10 is the total. And Slovakia sent 13 MiG-29s in April. So Ukrainian pilots are familiar with the Soviet-era warplanes, so that means that they could basically use them right away. And again, so Poland was the first one to decide to send these MiG-29s. If you remember, in the very early days of the war in April, I believe it was April 2022, Poland told the U.S., hey, we have these MiG-29 fighter jets. We want to give them to Ukraine, but we don't want to do it, so we'll give them to you, and you can send them to Ukraine. But the Pentagon said no. And the reason why they said no is because they were worried about escalation. And NATO officials said at the time that they would be worried Russia would view NATO providing warplanes as the alliance directly entering the war. But those concerns are gone now that these MiG-29s have been sent over there. So far, the U.S. has turned down requests to send the F-16 or other. They haven't gotten any Western fighter jets yet, but I think that's coming soon. The British are already training them on how to use them. And I believe the U.S. is as well. They have Ukrainian pilots are in the U.S. They say it's for assessments to see how long it will take to train them to fly the F-16 and F-15. But I mean, that just sounds a lot like training to me. All right, the next one here, hawks urge sanctions to stop Syria normalization. So the top Republican and Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee released a statement on Monday slamming Syria's readmission into the Arab League and urging President Biden to use sanctions to prevent further normalization. So this was Representative Michael McCaul, who is the head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Republican, and then the top Democrat on the committee, Gregory Meeks. They said in a statement, quote, readmitting Assad to the Arab League is a grave strategic mistake that will embolden Assad, Russia, and Iran to continue butchering civilians and destabilizing the Middle East. The United States must fully enforce the Caesar Act and other sanctions to freeze normalization efforts with this war criminal, end quote. So the Caesar Act that they mentioned, that imposed crushing economic sanctions on Syria in 2020 that are specifically designed to prevent the country's reconstruction. And that's what Blinken has said, that it's U.S. policy to oppose the reconstruction of Syria. And these sanctions have had a devastating impact on Syria's civilians, naturally. The House recently voted overwhelmingly to keep enforcing sanctions after that devastating earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey in February, and that killed thousands of Syrians. But the House voted to keep them under sanctions. And so what makes the Caesar Act sanctions so sweeping is that they allow the U.S. to sanction any person or entity for doing business with the Syrian government. So this means that U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and Jordan, which spearheaded the effort to bring Syria back into the fold, back into the Arab League, they could potentially be targeted. I mean, if Biden takes the advice of these two House members here, but I think their view is pretty prevalent among Congress. Again, Congress voted overwhelmingly to keep enforcing these sanctions. I want to look again at what the vote was here. Yeah, 414-2, with only Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene voting against this measure that was disguised as some support for Syrian civilians, but it was a measure to keep sanctions on. So I think if they really push this is going to be a way that the U.S. can really drive another wedge between them and Saudi Arabia. So anyway, but despite the U.S. position, the Saudis are not looking back here. On Tuesday, Syria and Saudi Arabia announced that they were reestablishing diplomatic ties for the first time in over 10 years. The State Department has denounced Syria's readmission to the Arab League, and they are against normalization. State Department spokesman Patel said on Monday, quote, "We do not believe that Syria merits readmission to the Arab League at this time. We continue to believe that we will not normalize our relations with the Assad regime, and we don't support our allies and partners doing so either," end quote. So on top of the crippling sanctions, the U.S. has about 900 troops in eastern Syria and backs the Kurdish-led SDF, allowing the U.S. to control about 1/3 of the country, where most of its oil resources are located. Syria's normalization with its neighbors could complicate the U.S.'s plans to keep occupying the country. So, writing this story today about Meeks and McCall, I think I might have been a little too optimistic about how the U.S. might not have a choice to lift sanctions and pull out of Syria if all these regional countries normalize with Assad. I forget how in Congress, again, just all of them most of them, the vast majority of them, kind of align with what McCall and Meeks are saying here, I think. So that's going to be a whole nother force. And there's all these lobby groups that don't want the U.S. to leave Syria. So there's still so many forces working to keep that occupation and keep the economic siege going there. The next one here, more on Syria. Syria and Turkey's foreign ministers to hold their first meeting in over a decade. So the Turkish and Syrian foreign ministers, they're going to meet in Moscow. It's a very significant step. They're going to meet on Wednesday. It will also be attended by the foreign ministers of Russia and Iran, and it will build on progress of other Russia-hosted talks between Syria and Turkey. And this effort started in December 2022 when the Turkish and Syrian defense ministers met for the first time since the Syrian war broke out in 2011. The Turkish foreign ministry, said that the officials at Wednesday's meeting will, quote, "exchange views on the normalization of relations between Turkey and Syria, discussing humanitarian issues and the voluntary, safe, and dignified return of asylum seekers," end quote. The engagement between Damascus and Ankara is significant as Turkey was a major supporter of the failed regime change effort against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and currently occupies areas of northern Syria. Damascus has made clear that any normalization deal must include the withdrawal of Turkish troops from Syrian territory. Turkish and Syrian officials last met on April 25th in Moscow when their defense and intelligence chiefs held talks. Again, that was in Russia. That was also attended by Russia and Iran. So after that meeting, there was a little back and forth. Kind of the Syrian and Turkish side were saying different things. Syria said, "Oh, we talked about withdrawal." Turkey said, "No, we didn't talk about withdrawal, but we made clear our condition for withdrawal from Syria." And that's the end of the YPG threat. And the YPG is the Kurdish, militant group that's part of the SDF, which the U.S. backs again. So the U.S. is very much in the way of, Syria and Turkey coming to an understanding here. But I think this is a long way off, like a normalization deal between them. But I think they're definitely headed in that direction. It's only a matter of time, but I think it will take a while. All right. I just want to mention now again that it is our fundraiser at antiwar.com. And this is how we, get by here, is that we rely on our readers and we have to do these fundraisers. And this is how we keep our editorial line, our anti-war and non-interventionist perspective. Believe it or not, there's not that much money in what we do here. We don't get big corporate donations. We're not sponsored by any corporations. And, you see what we're up against just look at the media around you and all the money that goes into warmongering and all that. So go to antiwar.com/donate and you could see all the different ways that you can support us with crypto, credit card, PayPal. You can make a monthly donation. So anything you can help us out with. Any donation means a lot to us. We really appreciate it. And it goes directly to running the website. All right. So back to the news here. The next one, joint U.S. and Philippine patrols to begin later this year. So the U.S. and the Philippines should start joint patrols in the South China Sea later this year. And this is according to the Philippine ambassador in the U.S. So he said, quote, an estimate would be no later than the third quarter of this year. We should have that in place, end quote. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and his Philippine counterpart announced earlier this year that they would begin joint patrols in the disputed waters, but did not say when they would start. When asked about the joint patrols, a spokesperson for the U.S. Embassy in Manila told Reuters, quote, our conversation on combined maritime activities with the Philippines are continuing, and our military planners are working hard on specific issues like logistics, end quote. So the U.S. joining the Philippines in patrols in the South China Sea will likely lead to dangerous confrontations between American and Chinese vessels, as Manila and Beijing often have standoffs near disputed reefs. The most recent incident took place in April when a Chinese vessel blocked a Philippine boat near Second Thomas Shoal, which is one of these disputed reefs in the South China Sea. It's controlled by the Philippines, also claimed by China, Taiwan, and Vietnam. So, if they're doing joint patrols, that means, these two boats almost collided. And if there's a U.S. ship involved there, it just really adds to the tensions, and it could create a very dangerous situation. And who knows what could happen if something spirals out of control in the South China Sea. So these comments about these patrols taking place later this year, it comes after the U.S. and the Philippines issued updated guidelines for the 1951 US-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty. The guidelines make it official that the U.S. is committed to intervening if a Philippine vessel comes under attack in the South China Sea, a pledge that has made the waters a potential flashpoint for a war between the U.S. and China. Definitely one of the most dangerous areas in that respect. All right, the next one here, President Biden to become the first president to visit Papua New Guinea. So the White House announced Tuesday that Biden will make this trip. He's going to be the first sitting president to visit this Pacific island nation. And this is all about the U.S. strategy against China. The White House said that Biden will stop in Papua New Guinea after the G7 summit of leaders in Hiroshima, Japan, which will be held from May 19th to the 21st. I'm sure all sorts of, announcements and rhetoric about China and Russia. It's, that's going to go down there. And then after he goes to Papua New Guinea, Biden is heading to Sydney, where he's going to take part in a summit of Quad leaders. And the Quad is the US, India, Japan, and Australia. And, Hawks in Washington see it as basically a potential foundation for an anti-China NATO alliance in the Asia Pacific. And they started doing joint military exercises together in 2020. And President Biden, I believe in 2021, held the first, in-person summit of Quad leaders. So this is all, part of this strategy against China. And the U.S. and Papua New Guinea have been in talks on reaching a deal to boost military ties known as a Defense Cooperation Agreement. Papua New Guinea officials have said that a potential deal could allow U.S. training and would focus on building up the Pacific Island nation's military. So if you're watching the video here, you just see where the country is located on the map, very close to Australia and next to the near the Solomon Islands. And that's kind of the big thing here. This deal between the U.S. and Papua New Guinea, which hasn't been signed yet, it's seen as the U.S. response to China signing a security agreement with the Solomon Islands. The U.S. and Australia were not happy about that. And while in Papua New Guinea, Biden will meet with the Prime Minister, James Marape. I might not be pronouncing that right. He's previously said that he does not want his country getting caught in the middle between the U.S. and China. They are, it seems like, moving a little closer to the U.S. And this military deal, it sounds like from what the leaders of the country have said, it's going to be focused on training the Papua New Guinea military. It's not going to involve like a buildup of U.S. forces yet, though. I mean, this is something that could lead to potentially the U.S. basing troops there. Um, so, only time will tell this, when it comes to their military cooperation. All right. So the next one that we have here, Australia urges the US to drop the case against Julian Assange. So a cross-party group of Australian members of parliament met with the US ambassador to Australia on Tuesday and called for Washington to drop the charges against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who's an Australian citizen. A lot of people forget that. The delegation of lawmakers known as the Bring Julian Assange Home Parliamentary Group told U.S. Ambassador Caroline Kennedy that there was a broad support for Assange in the Australian Parliament. Independent MP Andrew Wilkie said in a statement that the lawmakers, quote, impressed upon the ambassador that the broad support in the Australian Parliament for Mr. Assange, which was echoed clearly by both the Prime Minister and opposition leader last week when they said this matter had gone on long enough, end quote. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said last week that he was frustrated by the Biden administration's continued efforts to extradite Assange. I went over that story last week. Somebody in the comments mentioned, if he really cared that much about Assange, he wouldn't have gone along with, he could have used AUKUS, the submarine deal, as leverage. He could actually do things. Instead, he's just saying he's frustrated. So, but I think it's good to see this parliamentary group that they're putting some effort in here, going and talking to the ambassador. So if Assange is convicted, he faces up to 175 years in prison for publishing information related to the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that revealed U.S. war crimes. The conviction would set a dangerous precedent for press freedom in the United States and around the world, as Assange is not an American citizen, as I mentioned earlier. The Biden administration has come under more pressure to drop the charges against Assange, and he's been held in Belmarsh prison since April 2019, and that's when the Trump administration's Justice Department unsealed the indictment against him. More world leaders have been speaking out for Assange, including Lula, the Brazilian president. So he said this last week while he was in London, quote, "It is an embarrassment that a journalist who denounced trickery by one state against another is arrested, condemned to die in jail, and we do nothing to free him. It's a crazy thing. We talk about freedom of expression. The guy's in prison because he denounced wrongdoing, and the press doesn't do anything in defense of this journalist. I can't understand it," end quote. So what's interesting is Ambassador, Caroline Kennedy, who's the U.S. ambassador to Australia, she's the last surviving child of JFK, and her cousin, RFK Jr., he just launched his presidential bid, and he said recently that he would pardon Assange if elected. RFK Jr. wrote on Twitter, quote, "Instead of championing, sorry, I can't, I'm stumbling over my words here." So he's saying that the U.S. is actively persecuting journalists and whistleblowers. He said he will pardon brave truth tellers like Julian Assange and investigate the crimes that they have exposed. All right. We have one up from Consortium News. Mexico embraces Assange, and it's about Assange's father and brother. They were just in Mexico getting support, including from the president of Mexico, for Assange. So go check that out. It's pretty interesting what they've been up to. The next one here is from Middle East Eye. Israeli military kills 15 Palestinians in fresh Gaza attacks. So the Israeli military killed 15 Palestinians, including 3 Palestinian Islamic Jihad commanders, along with their wives and children, in a fresh attack on the Gaza Strip. So I went over these airstrikes yesterday when the news first broke, and this says a total of 40 fighter jets participated in bombing different locations in the besieged enclave just after 2 a.m. local time on Tuesday, according to the Israeli military. Another airstrike in the afternoon targeted a vehicle in Carrara town and Khan Yunis. The Palestinian Health Ministry said that at least 4 children, 5 women, a dentist, and his family were among those killed. So at least, from what I understand, 10 civilians, including 4 children, were killed in these strikes. The 3 Palestinian Islamic Jihad commanders And then there's 2 more people that were killed, and I'm not clear about those circumstances. I think those were different airstrikes, but just another slaughter of Palestinian civilians. And I haven't heard, today I was watching the stupid White House press conference and nobody asked about this. I'm sure that when they do ask, the US is going to say something like, oh, we support Israel's right to defend itself or some nonsense like that. When there was a pretty big flare up in Gaza in 2021 in the spring, it led to the death of over 250 Palestinians, including about 60 children. President Biden responded to that and Congress by giving Israel an extra $1 billion in military aid on top of the $3.8 billion that they get each year. So our government is, directly complicit in what they're doing to Gaza. All right. The next one here, this is from Responsible Statecraft, a real grand total of the military budget. And this is from Andrew Coburn. And what he talks about here is work from someone, I forget his name, Winslow Wheeler, and he's a defense analyst. And he calculates, the true military budget over what the National Defense Authorization Act is. So it's interesting if you want to go check it out. But he has this chart here. And it shows, let's see, is this by year? Okay, so 2023 as enacted. So the DoD budget is $848.8 billion. The DoD budget mandatory plus $11.4 billion. So the total DoD budget is $860.2 billion. But then if you factor in all this other spending, it goes up to $1.4 trillion, almost $1.5 trillion. So it's good work that this guy does to sum that up. Because, I always go over the NDAs and the requests, and I know it's not the true total, but it's hard to calculate it, what exactly it is. And this has things, including healthcare for veterans, and that's a big expense. $303 billion. Is that billion? Yeah. So, that's for Veterans Affairs. So that's a huge cost. And Homeland Security is in there, of course. So, 1.5 trillion about is what it will be. And then actually for 2024, he did the math with the requested budget and it's over $1.5 trillion. So that's a lot of money. Again, you see what we're up against. So that's it for the news. Go check out our viewpoints. One from Andrea Mazzarino, The Army That We Don't See. One from Judge Knapp, Does the federal government believe in the Constitution? One from Claire Burnish, Kent State, the school shooting the government doesn't want you to remember. That's over at the Free Thought Project. And, Kent State, that's happened on May 4th. And, when that May 4th comes around, everybody's talking about Star Wars, but it's a very important historical day when it comes to the National Guard shooting Vietnam War protesters. One from Jeff Groom, Are the Marines losing coveted relevancy in China battle space? That's over at Responsible Statecraft. Then our spotlight is from Daniel Larison, A Mindless Strategy of More Militarism for Its Own Sake. And that's at his Substack. So go read that. That's everything for me for today. Again, please help us finish up our fundraiser. You go to antiwar.com/donate to do that. Like and subscribe to this show on YouTube. We're also on Odyssey, Rumble. There's the audio version, which is how most people consume the show. I think I'm also going to start posting the video on Twitter because I saw that Tucker Carlson is going to be doing his show on there. And I never really thought of Twitter as like I've never watched anything longer than like a minute on there as anything good to consume like long form videos. But I figure if he's going to be doing it, it's probably going to catch on in some way. So I might as well do it. It doesn't hurt anything. So look out for that. You could always follow me on Twitter too, at DeCampDave. Follow antiwar.com on Twitter. That's everything. I'll be back tomorrow with more news for you. Thanks for listening.